Welcome to the Best Place to Work podcast, where we promise actionable tips from real business leaders on building amazing work cultures. Not tips from Google, but tips from the trenches of real-world businesses just like yours. If you're wondering what the role of artificial intelligence will be in the HR landscape, then you're in luck, because Anthony Onesto offers his insights on today's episode. Now, Anthony has scaled multiple teams from 30 up to 2,000 plus employees over his 18-year career in HR and tech startups. So today he talks about how you'll never, ever be able to automate the human side of human resources. So let's jump into the conversation. Well, today on the podcast, I have Anthony Onesto, who has a very interesting background in HR and technology, advising several startups, working with growing companies through ExoWorks as an advisor. Interestingly enough, also an advisor to SmartUp.io, which is a knowledge sharing program. I know that knowledge sharing and training inside of organizations is always a challenge to growing companies. So thank you so much for being on the show, Anthony.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, so I guess I'd really like to hear about SmartUp.io and kind of what problem you guys were looking to tackle, and especially as it comes to businesses, because I know that that's one thing as companies scale, they need a more advanced training solution, knowledge sharing solution, and I'm curious to hear about that journey.
Yeah, well, I think, the interesting thing about SmartUp is the position that we were taking at SmartUp was that an organization had knowledge within it already, right? Like, I think for decades, I've been a leader in HR for startups and large companies. And a lot of times when you're sitting in that HR leadership role, there's a certain ideology you have around learning and development where you believe the organization needs X, Y, and Z. And you do that through surveys, and you talk to managers, and you try to figure out, because ultimately with training and development, you want to fill a gap, right? So your organization's here, you need to get to here. And a lot of what we're talking about these days is digital transformation, right? Companies that have done things one way, but now with the digital forces that are happening, we need to fill in that gap. But what we were thinking at SmartUp was, content creation is so super difficult for companies of any size, even large companies, because you don't have a huge amount of resources in your HR and your training budgets. And in fact, some companies actually cut training budgets. It's the first thing they do when difficult times come, right? Which I think is completely silly. I mean, it's another podcast, by the way, another discussion. But what we were trying to solve at SmartUp was, there is content already within your organization. There's content that your organization has, their subject matter expertise within your organizations. And so what we've been encouraging people over the last, I would say, 6 to 8 years was to take that knowledge that they had and push it externally, right? So we've been saying, publish on LinkedIn, get your your subject matter expertise out into the workforce. But what was happening is it wasn't bringing it back into the organization, right? So we were saying, hey, be really smart externally, but don't put it internally. And there was pockets of that happening within organizations. You'd find like lunch and learns and things like that, but it wasn't exponential. And so the SmartUp was a platform to be able to do that so super easy that instead of pushing your expertise externally, which again, we agree that makes sense from a lot of different angles. You can actually take the knowledge, take your expertise, and push it out into the organization in somewhat like a Slack type of environment, but in a way that was so super easy to do and so engaging from a UX experience on mobile that people would want to go in there and start learning certain things. So that's sort of the gap, the challenge we were trying to provide, and we were also identified that, people within organizations, so there was this typical structure within organizations. So I am chief, something officer, or I'm director of, X, Y, and Z. But really where the passion comes in and where people get super excited is the stuff that they're doing on the side, right? And so how do we capture some of that really, that expertise, that passion that's hidden behind titles and structures, right? There were things that people do that I did as head of HR that you'd be absolutely floored in terms of what I've done that had nothing to do with human resources. So those are sort of the two areas and the two opportunities we saw at SmartUp.
So I think that's really interesting because I think that's a whole ball of wax when it comes to content marketing and it comes to internal training. And it's like the common excuse is like we don't have enough time. It's like
Yeah.
what do we focus on? I'm interested to hear what you said. You said that you did so much outside of the HR. What was that comment that you made right at the end there, or the on
You'd
the
be
side?
surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. Some of the stuff. So my last year at Razorfish, I actually created a service called Proto, which was 12-week design thinking and connection to startups for Razorfish, and that had nothing to do with human resources. And you would look at my title and say, oh, that guy's a human resource guy, and you would never know that for a year we were running a separate service that was focused on our Razorfish clients and taking them through innovation sprints so they can connect better to startups. So it's like that kind of stuff that we would try to unsurface within organizations using the SmartUp platform.
So that's an interesting comment because you know, people didn't know that you were in HR, but if you look at, a company that's growing, maybe they don't have an HR department or they have an HR person that's also doing other things. Where do you see the role of HR going, as these different tools are emerging that you're able to get some of the analytics back, some of the more feedback from your team? And, what is that becoming? Because you're kind of talking about, the knowledge sharing turning into outside content, turning into these like sprints where you're doing like design sprints or, developing other tools. I mean, what is that?
Sure.
It sounds like it's just bleeding into all areas of the organization. Where do you see that going, especially like in the mid market?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's always been HR fundamentally was to really interact from a human perspective, right? So the whole idea of human resources and the name itself is to be more human, right? To really figure out from a human perspective, how do we make organizations run better, right? It wasn't, it would have otherwise it would have been called Excel spreadsheet resources or like all the and HR got bogged down for years in really the tactical HR stuff, and I think there's couple of reasons for that. One, I think the tactical stuff is really easy. And what I mean by that is, if you Google search a question and you get an answer back, it's easy, right? Like that's, what's the FMLA rules in New York City? It's a finite answer. But once you start getting into, okay, we're a digital agency called Razorfish, and we're trying to get more into technology and then really drive into data sciences. How do we attract talent to our organization, which has been traditionally creative like that? Now think about that problem and that answer. It's like, that's hard stuff, right? That's hard to come up with. So I think what's happening is, and there is a solution, amongst the thousand things I do, we're working on artificial intelligence for human resources. So the concept, and we're actually originally it was called Sue.ai, but now we're changing the name. And I've, by the way, super happy, locked in the co-founders. It's a part-time gig. But it's essentially taking the tactical human resource stuff that bogs us down on a day-to-day basis and automating that, right? So automate all of that stuff, take that excuse away from human resources, and they become more strategic to the business. They sit in the business meetings and they're more strategic, but they're thinking of everything from a human perspective. Like, how can we get this client based on putting the right team together for that client? How do we use data? Like there's a blog article I wrote on my LinkedIn, and I talk about how we have to get, in HR, we have to get geekier, right? Like, so we have to use data to really drive the organization. Now, we don't have to get, don't sit in Excel spreadsheets, but figure out, what is the best team? Like what Google's a great example of this. It sounds a little cliche, but they figured out, the funniest thing is they use data to find out that if people like each other within a team, they work better. Like, we've known that for 20 years, but now that Google says it, it's now it's Bible, which is cool. But that kind of stuff, we need to really get super geekier in HR, and at the same time, and I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but we have to get super geekier, but also back to the human piece where every individual has individual needs, has individual wants, and how do we figure out to create custom HR solutions around the individual versus, okay, you're all sort of part of the one employment group, you all get the same benefits. It's like, that doesn't make sense. In today's super customized world, HR is so far behind in these things, and we need to start thinking differently about it.
This podcast is proudly sponsored by Waypoint. If you want to get your team aligned and you want to go from herding cats to a well-oiled machine, and if you're sick of the annual review process, then check out Waypoint. It's an elegant tool built for leaders just like you to help you invest in your people and unlock their true potential. Head over to waypointhq.com to learn more. You know, where's the balance there for a mid-sized company that maybe isn't the Google, that doesn't have all these data points or doesn't have all the advancements? I mean, what can they start to do of just looking at? It sounds like you're saying, let's look at what's actually happening and let's recognize patterns and let's have a structure to get those patterns and then figure out how we can optimize the organization people-wise, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you use the data points you have already, right? Even though you're a mid-sized company, there are data points. But it's also, if you take more of an IDEO approach to it, it's a design thinking, user-centric, right? HR has been historically company-centric, right? So HR has been formulated, structured to benefit the company and not the people. And we have to take a reverse ideology on that. We have to say, okay, what is the best thing for the employees? And thinking it from an employee-centric perspective. And that's everything. Like from, I talk about it in recruiting where, people walk up into your elevator and walk into your front. Like, what's that experience like? And is it welcoming to the individual? Like you have to start thinking about all these things from the user, from the human, from the employee perspective, and then use the data that's available to you. I mean, there's a lot of software out there for the mid-markets, namely, obviously, I'm an advisor, so full disclosure there, but there's software cheap enough out there to get this kind of data. But I always said this, if there's a way where you can mine, and it's a little bit big brotherish, so you got to be careful, but email and other things, you can actually get some really interesting data from that. Or just like you said, observe, just if you're a manager, stay super close to your small teams. And that's the data, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, a data farm like Google or, in dashboards or anything like that. It can be simply just observing how your employees are working. And the interesting thing is, in HR, there's, I put something on Twitter once, there's too many PhDs. Maybe that's the one you liked. There's too many PhDs in HR. Like we spend all this time sort of theorizing about organizations when actually they're existing already. They're organic. There are things that, so look at what's happening in the organization already. Look how are you successful in one area and not another, and try to replicate some of that stuff. So it already exists. Just like you said, observe a little bit more if you don't have all these data points like a Google.
Yeah, I think the PhD comment is interesting, and I'm pretty sure that is one that I liked, and I replied to you, and I was like, hey, let's talk about this some more. But it's interesting because, you have these big companies or these HR specialists and PhDs that say you should do this, you should do that. But at the end of the day, what is the practical application of that? And what does that actually look like, right? And what I'm hearing you say is it's fluid. It's going with what you have, and it's understanding what data points are out there. But so where does AI come into that? I mean, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, right? You're saying geeky, personal, but at one point, it does it really come down to the fact that the human capital is really going to be the scarce resource, right? I mean, that is attracting the best talent is the key differentiator. That's kind of what I've heard from people, and that's really the end goal, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, AI is going to have a huge disruption on the workforce. It just is. Like, there are very tactical things that people are doing today that AI is it's going to take over. Like, listen, there's two areas of philosophy you can subscribe to here. One is like AI is not going to do anything. It's completely terrible and it's never going to do anything, or it's going to destroy the world and we're going to be in, Terminator Salvation. Or you can take a mid road and say, you know what, some of the really crappy stuff that when you get home on a Friday after work and you're like, Jesus, if I could just outsource 40% of this, that's the stuff AI is going to hit first, right? That's first phase. But the thing is, I think it's advancing so greatly than any other, like mobile applications. The web, the internet took a little while. Mobile applications took a little while. I think AI, once they get it right, it's gonna permeate through organizations, and it's going to displace people, and it's going to be better. Like, there's a guy, Andrew McAfee. He's an MIT guy, and he wrote the book Second Machine Age. And I think there was another one, Race with the Machines was the first one. We had him speak at Razorfish. And he talks about, professors grading papers, right? So when you think about a recruiter looking at resumes, tell me, easy question. Recruiters looking at 100 resumes. By the 15th resume, the recruiter is exhausted, right? Like, it's just, you're going through all these resumes, and maybe you miss something really unique about the individual on number 16. A machine can bang through 100 of those, and it does not get tired with each one. In fact, at the 100th one, it's as equally as it's probably better at the 100th, because it's learning. Now, listen, everyone's talking. There's a great book, The Weapons of Math Destruction, where, algorithms, and we know, listen, if you want white males from Harvard and you put that into the algorithm, you're only going to get white males from Harvard. So we understand there are capability issues, but I think you cannot put your head in the sand. If you're an HR leader, like I was talking to someone at Mercer the other day, and they talked about AI. It's a hot topic with CEOs, and HR leaders are, they're basically throwing their hands up going, we don't know anything about it. Unacceptable. Like, you have to learn. You don't have to write algorithms. You don't have to be a deep learning machine learning data scientist, but you have to know how this is going to apply in your organization. Driverless cars completely going to disrupt the Uber, all this sort of stuff. So you can't put your head in the sand on these things. You got to know what's going on.
So how does a company get, how do you get started on, like, kind of a primer on that? How do you come up to speed on tools that are out there? How do you start to think about that stuff? Because it sounds like that the natural reaction is like, you hear about it in the news. Okay, whatever. That's either really far off, like you said, or it's not going to matter. So you kind of just go business as usual, or just put your head down. But you're saying, okay, no, you need to be aware of this. What's the tactics to do that, Anthony? What do you?
Well, I'm the kind of guy that likes, I'm not a huge, I don't like reading 30-page excerpts on this stuff. Like, I'm bored at page 3. It's just sort of, the way I'm a middle-class kid from New York. So, I like doing stuff. Like, so I saw the opportunity from an AI perspective in human resources, and what did I do? I went down the road of creating an HR AI bot, right? So I knew that there was something I wanted to solve, right? So same as Travis from Uber, right? He went on to the corner, couldn't get a cab, and he created Uber. Now, I'm not saying what I'm creating is Uber, but it's that sort of like, just do things. Reading is great. There's a great company called Fast Forward Labs, started by Hillary Mason. Hillary's super awesome, because what she does is take very technical data science, machine learning theories and ideas, and brings it super down low into very reasonable, commonplace kind of things. So she is super awesome at doing that kind of stuff. And I would, they have a newsletter. So look at some of these companies that are doing different things, and work with those newsletters and look for, opportunities to learn from there.
Cool. No, I think that's wise advice. So along with that, though, the more things like AI start to infiltrate organizations, where does the secret sauce come in for the human side of things, right? My speculation is it's more on the soft skills. It's more on the figuring out the people that like each other, work well together. It's the things that maybe the machines can't do that only humans can do. So how do you screen for that? And then how do you build up, training around that? How do you support your team to get better at those things that only they can do?
Yeah, good question. Sorry about that. I was getting interrupted there. So good question. I think, it's I don't have an answer. No, I'm kidding. No, listen, I think there are some basic steps, right? So, I think once we start taking the tactical work away, because I think right now everyone is super busy because the tactical pieces of these jobs are taken over. I think what happens is once you start removing some of that stuff, you automatically have time to return to the human piece, right? And so it's about connecting to folks. It's about having conversation, the ability to look folks in the eye. If you're a manager, right, this is where a lot of HR software goes off, right? So they're trying to replicate that relationship. So there's software to like, hey, check in with your team members. No, that's never going to replace, and none of the AI is going to ever replace that one-on-one with the manager. Maybe AI will say, you know what, actually today at 2:00 is the best time because this is typically when Anthony takes the best feedback. Maybe that, when I talk about getting geekier, that's what I mean. Like instead of just coming in on a Thursday and saying every random Thursday we're going to have a one-on-one, maybe there's certain parts of the day that Anthony gets feedback better or whatever it is. Like that's the super geeky stuff that we need to start thinking about. And you can pull from emails and understand tonality and other things, right? So again, a little big brother-ish, but you can do some of that stuff. So I think it allow us to be smarter in terms of how we manage people. But the one-on-one, it's to me the easiest thing is to follow, if you're familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk, right? VaynerMedia, super social media guy. He talks about intent. I think if you have the intent, the right intent, like my intent is to make sure that you're getting better at what you do, or my intent is to care about people. I think if you start with that it doesn't matter what, if you use the Ambassador Index or you do the 9-box thing. I mean, there's so many of these, it's crazy. Like how many, like let's do a 9-box. It's like, first of all, like where else in the world does a 9-box exist? Like, do you put your kids in a 9? Like, yeah, I think, Frankie's really smart, but I don't know if he has potential. It's just like the most silliest thing that we do. Like, just get back to just conversation. Just have a conversation. Find out what their hopes and dreams are. Like, I think this is why I say there's too many PhDs in HR. Like, we overanalyze these things. I think we can listen. There's some things that are good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not completely bashing 30 years of human resources, but who am I to do that? But I think there's basic conversations that we can get to, and just intent is such a huge thing for me.
No, I could not agree with you more. I think that is the key differentiator, is that relatedness. There's a guy that I've done a lot of reading on, Edward Deci, who talks about the 3 first principles of fostering intrinsic motivation. He talks about autonomy. So people need to feel autonomous in their role. So have some level of autonomy. They need to be competent, or at least feel like they're going up in competence. So they're getting more and more competent in their role. And then relatedness, so that their team around them, their manager and their team members actually cares about them. And then when those 3 things are actually like in concert and doing well, then that person is going to be motivated and productive. And I think that is, really the one-on-one is about the relatedness piece, but then making sure that those other 2 are in check. You know what I mean? It's understanding the competence level, how are you feeling, the autonomous, but that it all comes back to that. And that, to your point, that can't be easily replicated, even though people try to do that with tech.
It never will be. Like, let's just call it like I say never, and then 2 years, it's replicated. But I'm going to call it never. Like, you're never going to replace that human-to-human interaction. And I think, oftentimes we get bogged down in the how and not in the why, right? So the how is, okay, where's Anthony on the 9-box? We have to put him on the 10-box. He's over here in the corner box. There's like too many boxes. And then you have like a Ambassador Index, which again is interesting. It tells you intrinsically what are your motivators, or your creative innovator, right? There's important stuff to know. But then at the end of the day, it's like, like you said, the 3 principles, if it's super easy to follow and you have good intent, if your intent is always, like I said, if it's an employee-centric position, then you'll always do right by the employee. And that could mean, by the way, there was a guy that worked for me years ago at Fresh Direct, and super awesome guy, but he just, like, we were a crazy environment and he wasn't the right guy. And so we had, it wasn't a performance review meeting. It was like, how do I help you find a job somewhere else to really utilize what experiences are. And now he's like head of HR for this other company. Like, and he thanked me the other day, he's like, thank you for supporting me, teaching me, but also realizing that, I had hit my potential in the organization. So it's, if you care, if you take that employee first centric approach, having him out of the organization and someone new benefited the company, right? But it also benefited him. So yeah, I don't think it'll ever be replaced. It's too human.
Yeah, I agree. It all comes down to intent, and that's how it played out with that guy you're talking about. So.
Yeah, Gary Vaynerchuk, he talks about it all the time, and I loved it. Gary has a way of boiling things down really well, and intent was a good one.
We'll have to link that one up in the show notes. So.
Yeah, good idea. I love Gary. So put my name next to Gary anytime you want.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool.
Well, thanks so much for your time, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found the show valuable, please give us some love on iTunes. But if there's any reason that you would rate us less than 5 stars, please let me know. Shoot me a note at mike@bestplacetoworkpodcast.com. Thanks.